Hello and welcome to Red Pill Rundown. This month I'll be giving a book rundown on The Death of the West, How Dying Populations and Immigrant Invasions Imperil Our Country and Civilization by Pat Buchanan. Would you like to know more? No worries, because here's your quick rundown on The Death of the West. That title's getting more and more ironic. Sit down, this one's going to take a while. He starts off with a quote from Storm Jameson. "It has died. I say, died, not vanished, because it was a living organism, a civilization based on the family. What has taken its place is not alive. The family base should have been extended, cherished, encouraged." Pat then begins with an introduction talking about how America has undergone rapid change over the past decades due to third world immigration. This chasm in our country is not one of income, ideology, or faith, but of ethnicity and loyalty. Suddenly, we awoke to the realization that among our 31 million foreign-born, a third are here legally, tens of thousands are loyal to regimes with which we could be at war, and some are trained terrorists sent here to murder Americans. He then quotes from a play called The Melting Pot by Israel Zangwill, which states America is a great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. Pat states this is no longer the case. But the immigration tsunami rolling over America is not coming from all the races of Europe. The largest population transfer in history is coming from all the races of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and they are not melting and reforming. In 1960, only 16 million Americans did not trace their ancestors to Europe. Today the number is 80 million. No nation has undergone so rapid and radical a transformation. Uncontrolled immigration threatens to deconstruct the nation we grew up in and convert America into a conglomeration of peoples with almost nothing in common, not history, heroes, language, culture, faith, or ancestors. Balkanization beckons. Pat discusses how in the 90s European countries were giving away national sovereignty for economic interdependence, much to the delight of the elites, with those same elites controlling the media, and in doing so we are no longer one nation under God. These same elites turn our popular culture towards hedonism while removing old holidays, heroes, art, books, and morality to replace with those that are new and anti-American, all while demonizing those who hold to that which is traditionally American. Nietzsche calls it the transvaluation of all values. The old virtues become sins, and the old sins become virtues. Pat goes on to talk a little about how he ran for the presidency in 2000 and was often told by voters that while they agreed with him, they wouldn't vote for him as they had to stop Gore from becoming president, and therefore voted Bush. It wasn't just that they disagreed with Clinton and Gore, they detested them, and the cultural revolution that has taken place has poisoned American politics in much the same ways we still see today. Objective standards for morality, truth, and justice have gone away, and whatever aids the new elite is moral, and whatever goes against them, immoral. Pat states that while communism was the god that failed, the Marxists in U.S. college campuses from the 60s to the next millennium succeeded. This book is meant to describe that revolution from what it stands for and where it came from to how it turned America into a new country. Pat clarifies that the book pertains to more than just America, as it is called The Death of the West. The West is dying. Its nations have ceased to reproduce, and their populations have stopped growing and begun to shrink. Not since the Black Death carried off a third of Europe in the 14th century has there been a graver threat to the survival of Western civilization. Chapter 1 is called Endangered Species, noted with a quote from the London Times that the species in question are Europeans. Mr. Buchanan goes to write, "In 1960, people of European ancestry were 1/4 of the world's population. In 2000, they were 1/6. In 2050, they will be 1/10. Pat goes on to discuss Europe in particular, and that of the 20 nations with the lowest birth rates in the world at the time of writing, all but 2 were in Europe, all far below the replacement level of 2.1 births per woman. Pat believes the reasons for this include the European prevalence for socialism, in that pensions allow the adults to not need children to take care of them in their old age, and if women can earn as much of a man, to the point of financial independence, a husband is likewise not needed. Add in the increased use of contraception for sex without babies, and you get lower birth rates. By freeing husbands, wives, and children of family responsibilities, European socialists have eliminated the need for families. Meanwhile, it is noted that as Europe is dying, the Third World increases in population by 100 million people, a new Mexico, every 15 months. A conservative from Bavaria considers Germany's birth rate a time bomb and recommended a tripling of the child allowance for first 3 years of life. Pat notes this was called radical, but the day will soon come when it is not radical and needed. Considering the current subsidies for children to help Hungary's birth rate, I would say Pat was right. Italy, which gave us Rome and more, is also noted for going in the same dire direction as Germany, and that in a few generations Italy will become a theme park, in essence. Most young women in Italy stated they didn't want to have children for the sake of a career, and University of Rome demographer Antonio Gallini says the nation already relies on immigrants to bear the load of a deeply indebted pension system, and Italy will no longer be Italian as we know it. Likewise for Spain, with the lowest birth rate of Europe at 1.07 children per woman. A professor of sociology states that prosperity has strangled them, as people prefer comfort to sacrificing for the sake of a family. If 100 Spanish young people marry today, they can expect to have 58 children, 33 grandchildren, but only 19 great-grandchildren. What of Russia? With a birth rate of 1.35 children per woman, Russia's 147 million people will fall to 114 million by 2050, a greater loss than the 30 million dead attributed to Stalin. The situation is noted to be similarly dire in Great Britain and Japan as well. Soon after the Second World War, Japan became the second largest economy in a country smaller than Montana, an extraordinary achievement of an extraordinary people, notes Pat. Another interesting observation is made regarding Japan. It has the oldest median age in the world of 41, and was the first modern nation to legalize abortion back in 1948, ending their baby boom far before the Western nations. Europe has a dilemma. If the present birth rates do not change, an aging and shrinking population would necessitate an increase of taxes and simultaneous decrease of benefits, or import the Third World and become it. Pat writes that the reason such population predictions should be taken more seriously than that of a nuclear winter is that it is not a prediction but rather a description of what is currently happening, as Western fertility rates have been in decline for decades. It isn't because of what the Third World is doing, but rather what the First World isn't doing. Chapter 2 is titled, Where Have All the Children Gone?, and goes to explain and answer that question. He starts by stating what did not cause the decrease in birth rates. War and loss of empire, using the examples of birth rates significantly increasing in Germany between the world wars and after the second one, as well as America and Japan's birth rates post-World War II. Pat states the reason such high birth rates stopped is in dispute, but how the birth rates decreased is not. A large role was and is still being played by contraception and abortion. Historians may one day call the pill the suicide tablet of the West. It was first licensed in 1960. By 1963, 6% of American married women were using Dr. Rock's invention. By 1970, 43% were on the pill. By the year 1966, 6,000 abortions were being done every year, rising up to 600,000 a year in the 70s and 1.5 million a year in the 80s, with almost a third of modern pregnancies ending by abortion. In 2000, the FDA approved a drug that essentially performed an abortion that could be used during the first 7 weeks of pregnancy, produced by a Chinese company. Pat states that some may characterize China's role as an act of assisted suicide towards the US, which stands in their way of further power accumulation. Pat believes the 60s were a pivotal decade that drove a moral wedge between millions of Americans, with young Americans then being converted to new ways of thinking, believing, and living. The parents of baby boomers had survived the Great Depression and wished their children to not have it as rough as they did. So the baby boomers were raised differently, spending almost as many hours in front of a television as in school. By the mid-1950s, parents had a serious rival for their children's attention. The message that came from TV, especially the ads, was instant gratification. By 1964, boomers hit college campuses around the Western world, having never known hardship or war, and student riots and rebellions took place. Cultural revolutions came with them, such as the drug revolution, the sexual revolution, and equal rights for women. If men could be praised for sexual activity, why not women? However, the sexes are not equal and women ran the risk of pregnancy. There was a demand for the solution, and the free market provided two: the pill and abortions. Old sanctions against promiscuity collapsed, and a new moral code rose up to justify the changes. Higher education certainly played no small role, and that combined with the control of the media by elites, in went normal Americans and out went radicals. And the message the dominant culture emits, day and night, reacts with mocking laughter to the old idea that the good life for a woman means a husband and a house full of kids. Pat notes in an agricultural economy, both parents are at home and labor together, resulting in the extended family. After the Industrial Revolution, the husband went to work at the factory while the wife stayed home to raise the kids, and this gave us the nuclear family. Now, in the post-industrial economy, both parents go to work, and no one stays home to raise the children. This results in children raised by daycares, not to mention media and often government-run education, or no children at all. Pat quotes a political science professor, James Kurth, who states the greatest movement of the second half of the 19th century was men going from farm to factory, and the greatest movement of the second half of the 20th century was women going from the home to the office. In 1950, 88% of American women with children under 6 stayed home. By the 21st century, that dropped to 36%. Another factor in the equation, certainly related to boomers already being noted for having been raised without much hardship, is affluence. The rich tend to have less kids, so as the quality of life and incomes of the middle class grew, the less children they had. Men were once paid a family wage to support a wife and children in dignity without the wife having to leave the home to work. But that is now far gone for most. A very interesting observation is made by Pat in that Frederick Engels, a collaborator of Karl Marx, wrote that in order to liberate the wife, the whole female sex needs to be brought into industry, demanding the abolition of the family. Is it not a remarkable coincidence how global capitalism's view of women, as units of production, liberated from husbands, home, and family, confirms so precisely to the view of the fathers of global communism? As women entered the man's working force thanks to the feminist movement, there was a surge in the labor supply, dropping the price as demand hadn't as significantly changed. Incomes decreased for men who could no longer provide for a family. Women could achieve interdependence and choose more often not to marry and have kids. Pat states that with the Democrats beholden to feminism and the Republicans to corporate interests and free market principles, the result is a large family being an endangered species. Pat also notes the decline of faith in the West correlating with other declines. There was also a movement in the 60s and 70s for population control and a conscious reduction in births. But though the message was taken to heart by the first world wealthy and middle class, it was largely ignored by the third world poor at whom it had been targeted. Pat gives more attention to feminism, which has now become synonymous with abortion, though the early feminists like Susan B. Anthony were against the practice. In the Jewish World Review in February 2000, in a piece titled Now, Pro-Fatherhood Funding is Unconstitutional, Sheila Cronin was quoted, "Since marriage constitutes slavery for women, it is clear that the women's movement must concentrate on attacking this institution. If the preservation of peoples of European ancestry, and of the Western civilization they have created, were up to the feminists, Western man would have no future. Additionally, the culture has changed towards more individualism, where people care more and more about themselves, sometimes solely, in which case, children is seen as a burdensome option." Pat also argues that culture change and lowering of moral values is evident in the increased acceptance of homosexuality, which beyond the time he wrote this book has continued down a slippery slope to trans children going on drugs and child drag queens twerking for money at gay nightclubs. As is often made to the US, a comparison to Rome is made, as in the later years of the empire, particularly after Hadrian, the population of Romans decreased due in part to infanticide, sexual excess, and the avoiding or delaying of marriage. Chapter 3 is Catechism of a Revolution, and covers what the new faith of the world holds and teaches, being that our world is the only one and that seeking pleasure in this short life is the ultimate end. Like the 10 Commandments of the Bible, Pat lists off commandments of the new religion of the West, the first being that all lifestyles are equal, the second being thou shalt not be judgmental, and so on. The new religion is a globalist one, wanting to take away national sovereignty in favor of institutions of global governments from the UN and WTO to the IMF and the WHO. Pat notes any religion needs devils as well as angels, so in this case the Western people and their past are the devils, certainly still true today as statues fall down. The white race is the cancer of human history. The white race, and it alone, eradicates autonomous civilizations wherever it spreads, wrote Susan Sontag, a birth mother of the Revolution, in 1967. The idea that everything Western is fundamentally racist and sexist is no longer the exception, but the rule of our society, especially in higher education. In doing so, America is weakened, and that is the point, says Pat. In moving this indictment, the revolution has complementary goals: to deepen a sense of guilt, to morally disarm and paralyze the West, and to extract endless apologies and reparations until the wealth of the West is transferred to its accusers. It is moral extortion of epic proportions, the shakedown of the millennium. If the West permits its enemies to pull this off, we deserve to be robbed of our inheritance. In this new religion, equality is the highest principle, though anything not Western is a bit more equal. Anything that helps the new faith is good and holy, and anything against it is a sin. The wars against communist forces were therefore evil, but the times where we sided with them or fought for equality were just and pure, and the ends justify the means. That Mr. Lincoln made himself absolute dictator, trampled on the Constitution, imprisoned dissidents without trial, and unleashed Generals Sherman and Sheridan to burn the South to ashes was fine. The eradication of slavery justified the means employed, even if fellow Americans suffered terribly. As for the Good War, World War II, allying ourselves with the mass murderer Stalin and firebombing cities like Nagasaki, killing scores of thousands of women and children in hours, were acceptable because our hearts were pure and our enemy was evil. Pat brings up historical examples that ring very similar to the events of 2020. A man who assassinated an NAACP leader in 1963 is tried 3 times, the third being 30 years later, and died in prison. But the murderers of 2 FBI agents and a cop, Peltier and Mumia, are shown leniency. As Peltier is an Indian and Mumia is black, they qualify as members of a victim class, but 2 dead FBI agents and a dead cop, 3 white males, do not. Pat wrote that the equality the revolution preaches is a corruption of what Jefferson stated: all men are created equal. Jefferson did not mean that literally, but that all were to be treated equally under the law, with equal rights to pursue life, liberty, and property. As Jefferson wrote to John Adams in 1813, "I agree with you that there is a natural aristocracy among men. The grounds of this are virtue and talent." Pat states that it is more true to say that no 2 men were ever created equal, and America is not about equality of result or condition, but freedom, which creates a natural hierarchy based on abilities and achievements from athletics to arts to science and beyond. And such resulting leaders can set an example which inspires us all to aim for such a mark. Hierarchies are as natural as they are essential. As history demonstrates, all peoples, cultures, and civilizations are not equal. Some have achieved greatness often, others never. All lifestyles are not equal. All religions are not equal. All ideas are not equal. Pat does mention that all ideas have a right to be heard, but not to automatically be respected. Society advances by separating the wheat from the chaff, and ridding themselves of the chaff. If democracy dies, it is equality that kills it. Those who endlessly revise scholastic aptitude tests, because the results collide with their preconceptions, then give extra points to students based on ethnicity, then throw the tests out because they still do not yield the desired results, are hopeless ideologues whose false ideas about human nature will never survive the first collision with reality. The new faith preaches tolerance, but only for what they like or don't care about, like sexuality. In the new dispensation, you can make a movie depicting Jesus Christ as a wimp who lusts after Mary Magdalene, as in The Last Temptation of Christ, but suggest a link between heredity and intelligence, as Charles Murray did in The Bell Curve, and you will learn what it means to cross the revolution. Hate crimes are also a part of the revolution. Pat notes that everyone has their bias, but the murder of a homosexual because he is gay is somehow worse than the rape and murder of a child because the former is a hate crime. The reality is that murder is murder and should be punished equally under the law. The media, being on the side of the revolution, is almost entirely complicit. The murder of a homosexual got thousands of articles, while the rape and murder of a 13-year-old boy, named Jesse Dirkesing, by 2 homosexual men got hardly covered at all. A black man was dragged to death by a truck driven by a white man, and the news was full of outrage. A 6-year-old named Jake Robble was dragged to death by a car driven by Kim Davis, and did not receive the same coverage. Why did this crime not get national attention? Because Jake Robble was white and Davis is black. Hate crimes are the cultural elite's way of racially profiling white males. Pat also includes other examples of interracial crime not considered kosher enough to cover by the media elites, but I don't feel like making this video not safe for work, and you get the idea. Crime statistics are also brought up, and interracial crime is very heavily in one direction but not the other, and not in the way the media would report. Such statistics, including those brought up by Jared Taylor's New Century Foundation from Justice Department numbers, are almost always never challenged and ignored, notes Pat. He makes the comment that such statistics are certainly hard to hear for minorities, but that self-deception solves nothing. Additionally, if racial crime statistics seem to have Western folk as the victims more often than not, and such facts are not politically correct to cover, why even bother having hate crime statutes at all? A crime is a crime and should be punished no matter the creed or color of the perpetrator. Justice should be colorblind. But this campaign to codify certain crimes as hate crimes has nothing to do with justice and everything to do with ideology. Pat ends this chapter by stating that like a religious ritual, the media must repeatedly cover hate crimes that fit their narrative, and so they constantly chase after them. The same story, the same plot, hero and villain, for each new hate crime the media covers helps reaffirm their belief that America is deep down an evil nation. Chapter 4 is titled, For Who Made a Revolution, and starts off by discussing Marx's failure of predicting a workers' uprising around the world against a great war, as the revolution did not take place during either world war. Man was united by nation and people, not class. Man was united by nation and people, not class, and the worker was a member of the national family like everyone else. Instead, the culture of the West was to be destroyed so the Marxist fruits could grow in their place. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian communist in the 1920s, who argued the following as summarized by Pat. Rather than seize power first and impose a cultural revolution from above, Gramsci argued, Marxists in the West must first change the culture. Then power would fall into their laps like ripened fruit. Then the people could be slowly educated to understand and even welcome the revolution. Of course, this included a takeover of the arts, schools, and the news media, among other institutions. Pat goes on to bring up the Frankfurt School, a collection of communists who set up an institute in Frankfurt University in 1923. They went about retranslating Marxism, as they had understood Marx had failed in assuming the working class was for the revolution. To old Marxists, the enemy was capitalism. To new Marxists, the enemy was Western culture. To old Marxists, the path to power was the violent overthrow of the regime, as in Paris in 1789 and in St. Petersburg in 1917. To the new Marxists, the path to power was non-violent and would require decades of patient labor. But, in 1933, history rudely intruded. Adolf Hitler ascended to power in Berlin, and as the leading lights of the Frankfurt School were Jewish and Marxist, they were not a good fit for the Third Reich. The Frankfurt School packed its ideology and fled to America. With the assistance of Columbia University, they set up their new Frankfurt School in New York City, and redirected their talents and energies to undermining the culture of the country that had given them refuge. Once in America, they developed critical theory, defined as the essentially destructive criticisms of all the main elements of Western culture. This includes the family, patriarchy, hierarchy, morality, tradition, sexual restraint, loyalty, nationalism, ethnocentrism, and so on. Using critical theory, the cultural Marxist repeats the charge that the West is guilty alone in all the greatest sins of history, and such sins flow from the character of the West. Likewise, as early as the 1960s, conservatives have been routinely labeled fascists, an idea from the Frankfurt School that was also laid down by the Moscow Central Committee in 1943. When obstructionists become too irritating, label them as fascist, or Nazi, or anti-Semitic. The association will, after enough repetition, become fact in the public mind. In one of the Frankfurt School's writings, it is noted that the American people must be treated as mentally ill and should be subjected to collective psychotherapy. Rather than make a rational philosophical argument, the Marxists instead opt for psychological conditioning of the masses. For that the schools must teach students that their parents' beliefs are racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on, caring more about graduates being conditioned properly to have the right attitudes than actual education and knowledge. And to think U.S. schools have been doing this as early as the 40s and 50s. Of course, the media also had a role to play, with Hollywood essentially becoming filled to the brim by cultural Marxism, attacking traditional values and truth with movies that portray the opposite. women being stronger than men, children being wiser than their parents, and so on. Instead of subverting society primarily by words and books, the Frankfurt School would prioritize sex and drugs, urging a universal embrace of the pleasure principle, rejecting the cultural order to chase after whatever feels good in the moment. A new form of tolerance is another idea supported by the Frankfurt School, where tolerance is preached, but in action is only for left-wing ideas while being extremely intolerant of right-wing ideas, to the point where a paroled killer would be more welcome as a university guest speaker than someone on the right. The family unit was seen as the cradle of fascism by the Frankfurt School, and like other aspects of the West, must be destroyed to make way for the revolution. They advocated for matriarchy or androgynous, interchangeable parental roles. This is also noted by Pat as being reflected in Hollywood, with strong women comforting weak and sensitive men, which rings similar to the last book I covered, The Rational Male. Sex education in elementary schools can also be attributed to the Frankfurt School. Pat argues the Frankfurt School should be a prime suspect and principal accomplice in the death of the West. The result of cultural Marxism certainly bears strong influence on the lowered birth rates of Western people and nations. The four who made a revolution are the Marxists Lukács, Gramsci, Adorno, and Marcuse. Pat finishes the chapter by noting that it may be inevitable for a nation that reaches affluence without any struggle to degenerate, and it certainly didn't help that the conservatives were too focused on tax rates, trade deals, and GDP to fight back in the Marxist cultural war. Chapter 5 is about the coming Great Migrations, going into further depth on the issue of immigration. Pat restates the demographic trends and aging populations of the West. Only 4 solutions exist: raise taxes to cover pensions, go into more debt to cover pensions, increase the native birth rate, or mass immigration. America, and especially Europe, have already seen mass immigration take place and continue to take place. Pat references the fictional novel The Camp of the Saints, which is about an invasion of France by the Third World, with France unwilling to fight back out of a sense of egalitarianism, truly prophetic. An interesting prediction is made by Pat that China will reclaim territory once owned by them from Russia, as China's population continues to grow and Russia's population decline. Before the middle of this century, Beijing will likely try to regain those lands, and Alaska's neighbors across the Bering Strait could be tough young Chinese pioneers rather than elderly Russians. Already, Chinese settlers are moving into Russian territory, just as Americans once moved into Mexico's northern province of Texas before tearing it away. Former Soviet lands that are Islamic may also be looking to take away Russian territory. Demography is destiny, notes Pat. Anatoly Antonov, head of the Department of Family Sociology at Moscow State University, wants the Russian government to use media to boost the image of the family, and states that if the population decline isn't reversed, extremists will seize power in the name of survival, resulting in a fascist state. Pat goes on to discuss the increasing legalization of euthanasia and assisted suicide, sometimes not of a voluntary nature, and how this too affects the diminishing Western population, using the Netherlands as an example when they passed a law where even some children can get legal assisted suicide. This can be seen as a way of reducing the rising senior population in the West and the associated expenses that come with them, be they medical or pensions. However, not only is it unethical and combined with abortion creates a culture that does not respect human life, but also does nothing to treat the real disease, being the low birth rates. The baby boomers of Europe may live to see their lives ended, without their consent, by a society that has turned as callous toward their wish to stay alive as they were to the unborn in their own time. What goes around comes around. Islam is also seen as a threat to the West, partly because of their significantly higher birth rates and history of aggression. As the Christian tide goes out in Europe, an Islamic tide comes in. In 2000, for the first time, there were more Muslims in the world than Catholics. Pat states that while the West is far ahead of the Islamic world in terms of science, industry, and so on, Islam still has what the West has lost: a desire to have children and the will to carry on their civilization. Today, it is as difficult to find a Western nation where the native population is not dying as it is to find an Islamic nation where the native population is not exploding. Pun probably not intended. Pat finishes the 5th chapter by noting history is full of civilizations that rise and expand, ruling over other peoples, and then receding and offering equality to the subjected peoples, who acquire more power to begin their own rise and expansion. Chapter 6 is called La Reconquista, and shifts the focus away from Europe to America's southern border. Pat starts off with some basic history of US-Mexico relations, particularly relating to Texas and later other parts of the Southwest and California, to make the point that Mexico has historic grievances towards the US that are not easily forgotten. There are thus deep differences in attitudes toward America between old immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe, and today's immigrants from Mexico. Pat makes a list of points to help us understand this difference. Point number 1 is that the immigration from Mexico is significantly higher than the norm, while also mostly staying in the US Southwest, contrary to the Founding Fathers' wishes that immigrants spread out among the population for the sake of assimilation. Number 2. Mexicans not only come from another culture, but millions are of another race. History and experience teach us that different races are far more difficult to assimilate. The 60 million Americans who claim German ancestry are fully assimilated, while millions from Africa and Asia are still not full participants in American society. The third point is that they often come here illegally. The fourth, that unlike immigrants from Europe who bid their native land farewell, Mexico is right next door, and Pat argues many Mexicans have no desire to learn English or become citizens, as they wish to remain proud Mexicans, as they should if they stayed in Mexico. Therefore, they generally don't desire to assimilate and instead have small sections of US cities for themselves with media and stores in Spanish, a nation within a nation. The fifth and final point is that Mexicans are not coming to the same America that old European immigrants did. Today's America had culturally degenerated as previously noted, and glorifies multiculturalism, further decreasing assimilation. Pat quotes Samuel P. Huntington, who states that if over 1 million Mexican soldiers crossed the border, it would be treated as a national security threat. Likewise, over 1 million Mexican civilians crossing over are a comparable threat to American societal security. The same could be said for Europe and their Islamic migration situation. Pat predicts balkanization, citing the similar breakups over ethnicity and culture in Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, and how in England the flag of St. George is becoming more popular than the Union Jack in some instances. People identify less and less with the nation-state, more and more with kith and kin. Is our country more than just an economy? The change in birth rates makes the situation worse, as noted by Jose Gutierrez, a political science professor at the University of Texas at Arlington. We have an aging white America. They are not making babies. They are dying. The explosion is in our population. Going back to the thought of the US being just an economic zone, Pat asks, why should Mexican immigrants have greater loyalty to the US than their homeland if they broke in simply to find work? The current immigration from Mexico into primarily the southwest of the US is a Reconquista, a reconquering, and many are fully aware of this. Pat makes it known that the Mexican government even gives out free survival kits in poor cities along with information on how to avoid US border patrols to get to California for free social services. Meanwhile, the US guards the borders of other nations like in South Korea. Pat explains the history of the Nixon-Reagan coalition, where the GOP targeted Northern Catholics and Southern Protestants on elections of patriotism, populism, and social conservatism, luring them away from the Democrats. Success gave the GOP decisive margins in the industrial states and a solid South that had been the base camp of the Democratic Party since Appomattox. Democrats could carry 90% of the minority vote, but if the GOP took 60% of the white vote, over 90% of the total, they won. The new Democrat solution was to import voters from the Third World instead, to the delight of the GOP from a standpoint of economic growth, thanks mostly to the Immigration Act of 1965, which shifted legal immigration away from Europe. The US population was 88.6% white in 1960 and could be as low as 61% in 2020, wrote Peter Brimelow of Forbes. Just as Reagan and Nixon took the South from the Democrats have taken their home state of California from the GOP, becoming America's Quebec or Ulster of sorts as whites became a minority in the state by the year 2000. Immigrants overwhelmingly vote Democrat for good reason. They aren't net contributors to taxes, taking more from social programs than they put in. Why should immigrants support a Republican Party that cuts taxes they don't pay over a Democratic Party that will expand the programs on which they do depend? Economically, this isn't a good deal for America either, with the exceptions being the benefits of lower wages and higher rent for corporations and landlords. The added costs of schooling, healthcare, welfare, social security, and prisons, plus the added pressures on land, water, and power resources, exceeded the taxes that immigrants contribute. Pat finishes this chapter by asking, what is a nation? As John Jay states, a nation is one people united by ancestry, language, culture, and so on. The observation is made that the United States is no longer any of those things. Chapter 7 is about the war against the past, being how the elites go after the memory of the West to undermine and subvert its people. Destroy the record of a people's past, leave it in ignorance of who its ancestors were and what they did, and one can fill the empty vessels of their souls with a new history, as in 1984. Dishonor or disgrace a nation's heroes, and you can demoralize its people. It's noted that standard operating procedure is now not to attack a political opponent's arguments, but their personal character, the politics of personal destruction that stemmed from the cultural Marxists and their critical theory. Such acts are the cultural equivalents of vandalizing a grave or desecrating a corpse. In a way, it's simple. Take the good parts of the past and either vilify them or put them down the memory hole to be forgotten, and hyperbolize and magnify any historical faults to effectively kill patriotism and deconstruct the country. As we can see, the effects of this are clear as day in the US and parts of Europe as well. Columbus, Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, and many more made out to be pure evil instead of men of great achievement. Before long, the West will forget who it was, and that too contributes to the death of the West. When the Europeans arrived in the Americas, some indigenous tribes were still practicing cannibalism, and not one had invented the wheel. Yet it is the West now proclaimed to be irredeemably wicked. For examples of all this, Pat gives a summary of American history and its achievements, and talks specifically on how Columbus, the Founding Fathers, are shown to be nothing but evil as part of the modern historical revisionism, including the taking down of statues, digital book burning, as well as the renaming of streets, schools, and sports teams that have sadly become commonplace almost 20 years after this book was written. We can finish this chapter off with a quote twice mentioned by Pat from Solzhenitsyn. "To destroy a people, you must first sever their roots." Chapter 8 is named De-Christianizing America and discusses the decline of the Christian faith throughout the West. Pat notes that religious institutions were also the target of cultural Marxism, and as Western faith declined, birth rates also declined. "America is a Christian nation," Governor Kirk Fordice famously said back in 1992. Before the Mississippi governor sat down, he was being denounced as an intolerant bigot for not using Judeo-Christian. Yet, as Gary DeMar writes in America's Christian History, The Untold Story, the governor was right about America's origins and first 250 years. Pat then cites several famous pioneers, politicians, and court justices that affirm America was a Christian nation. Part of how America lost its faith, Pat writes, is due to judicial activism at the highest level, the Supreme Court. Using the incorporation clause of the 14th Amendment, the court asserted a right to impose on the states all the restrictions the Constitution had imposed on Congress. At that point, the 10th Amendment was dead, and the states of the Union became subject provinces of the Supreme Court. After this, prayer and religious teaching was taken out of schools, Christian symbols taken off courthouses, and so on. The lower courts followed the Supreme Court in suit. The Humanist Manifesto of 1973 has had its effect on the West, diminishing its faith in favor of secularism, abortion, euthanasia, globalism, and so on. Pat argues secular humanism is a religion as well, the current faith of the elites, being imposed via court justices against the will of a faithful people who too often concede ground in the name of equality. Going off of prior talk of indoctrination in schools, new priests and pastors attempted to reconcile their faith and the new humanist counterculture, with poor results. Like a gun control advocate asking for a supposed compromise, at the end of the day the anti-gun proponent gains more gun control, and the gun owner gets his rights slowly taken away in a very one-sided fashion. The Father, Son, and Holy Ghost in some churches have been made gender-neutral to Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Some old hymns have also been reworded in more modern congregations to be less exclusionary as well. Beyond this book, as it was written back in 2002, this has gone further, with some churches removing crosses to be more friendly to Muslims, as well as being pro-LGBTQ-ABC. A recent non-religious example I've noticed would be the Founding Fathers being called the Framers. It's more gender-neutral that way. No court forces these churches to make fools of themselves. They wanted to be relevant and made themselves irrelevant. For those who believe Christianity can peacefully coexist with such cultural Marxism, consider that in communist lexicon, peacetime simply meant continuing the struggle by means other than war. Pat uses modern art as an example. Andreas Serrano's Piss Christ was a photograph of a large crucifix immersed in his own urine. Pat gives plenty more examples, but you get the idea. Of course, such insults in art against the Prophet Muhammad won't be treated the same way, as those in France know well. Additionally, a second sex revolution occurred relating to homosexuality. The APA changed it from a disorder to a neutral condition. The media began promoting it as an acceptable lifestyle, sex education in schools modified, and the laws changed in their favor as well. The Founding Fathers stated the Constitution was made for a moral and upright people. It simply won't work for a people lacking virtue. Pat finishes this chapter by asking, how do we create a virtuous society when we no longer can agree on what is virtuous? Chapter 9 is titled Intimidated Majority, and starts off with a provocative quote from Mary Berry, chairman of the U.S. Civil Rights Foundation. Civil rights laws were not passed to protect the rights of white men and do not apply to them. Pat goes on to say conservatives have certainly been the losers of the culture war, despite having political power at times. Polls showed the American people did not want women in combat, abortion on demand, and racial preferences, wanting immigration reduced and English made the official language. Yet, the right is by and large an intimidated lot, says Pat. The Republicans have let the Democrats set the stage and define the rules of the cultural game, and the Republicans continually try to appeal to and appease left-wing values to no avail. Whenever critics demand that Republicans reach out to those who have again and again bitten their hand, the party obediently reaches out and is bitten again, to the undying amusement of its tormentors. Conservatives are no longer fighting the culture war against the left, they are conscientious objectors, according to Pat. Such cowardice will cost them the country, as they can be silenced by threat of being called a racist or bigot. Pat states there are several reasons as to why this is the case. The first is that the followers of Reagan and Goldwater were drawn in due to the Cold War. Once that ended, they had no cause to unite under. Secondly, conservatives tend to focus on economics and tax rates, ignoring issues of morality and culture, giving the left victories by default, as if there was a baseball game and the left won due to conservatives not bothering to show up on game day. They may believe such issues don't belong in politics, but such beliefs deny the reality of the situation. A case of intellectual sloth, says Richard Weaver. Another reason is one previously expanded upon, being the left's control of the media and education indoctrinating the youth. The third reason is that unlike typical political matters where compromises can be made, morality and culture are a zero-sum game. One's win is another's loss. An example of this, writed Pat, is how conservative Supreme Court justice nominees are torn to shreds by the left going back to Nixon and Reagan, while Ruth Bader Ginsburg was easily confirmed without issue under Clinton. Press S to spit. Fourth, over 30 years of pounding has pulverized Christian morale, as Pat argues that the media has continually attacked and ridiculed such establishments to the point of battle fatigue. So, Christians save their protest for the privacy of the voting booth, but those they elect often have no more stomach for this battle than they do. Fifth, Americans are generally raised to respect and obey the law, and feel that if the government is acting constitutionally, they will comply. By definition, conservatives are not rebels, but neither were the Founding Fathers until pushed to the wall. The last point is that young adults now have grown up with cultural Marxism, and it is the traditional America they see as a foreign entity. Pat takes a note from Dr. Sam Francis in that winning a culture war does not mean conserving something, but overthrowing something. Conserving what is left of your slice of gun rights pie is not a winning strategy as it grows smaller and smaller. You must at some point go on the offensive and gain ground. The right needs to realize the left does not just disagree, they hate the right and believe they are evil. Why else would anything right of center be so demonized as Nazi this and fascist that? Pat notes that this has a mental benefit to the left, not only in forcing an opponent to defend his character before even discussing his positions, but also that the more one demonizes the enemy, the more one makes a hero out of himself. Pat notes that it is a dream of the oppressed to become the oppressor, and the civil rights movement has gone from wanting equal rights under the law to policies far beyond in the name of fairness. Every revolution eventually puts on the robes of the tyrant, and every political cause turns into a business and then a racket. This makes sense as the cultural Marxist game of crying racism at everything is very profitable in the modern West. Pat quotes Booker T. Washington. There is a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Pat makes a good point, saying that while the West did participate in slavery in the past, the West alone abolished it, and slavery still continues to this day in Africa. The West believes that if they accept the demands of the racketeers, there will be peace in our time. However, the demands will never cease, as the racketeers would have to find new jobs. Pat says flat out that the time for apologies is in the past, and it's time to just say no. Pat continues to make quotes that are extremely relevant almost 2 decades later. With the White House the prize, why would Democrats give up a race card that is the ace of trumps in urban America? Why do Republicans continue, election after election, to devote such energy and effort trying to crack the most solid voting bloc the Democratic Party has? Why do they not go hunting where the ducks are? White males are the victims of quotas, affirmative action, set-asides, and reverse discrimination. If the GOP would come out for an end to racial preferences and a moratorium on immigration and appeal to the great silent majority, as Democrats appeal to minorities, the party's chances in national elections could not but improve. Chapter 10, the last, is called A House Divided, and goes on to summarize Pat's discussion on the death of the West and give practical solutions. He states there are 4 clear and present dangers: a dying population, mass immigration, a defection of ruling elites to a more globalized government, and the rise of anti-Western culture within the West. Pat reminds us that communism and cultural Marxism are not the only enemies, but global capitalism as well. And just as globalism is the antithesis of patriotism, the transnational corporation is a natural antagonist of tradition. With its adaptability and amorality, it has no roots. It can operate in any system. With efficiency, its ruling principle, it has no loyalty to workers and no allegiance to any nation. With share price and stock options its reasons for being, it will sacrifice everything and everyone on the altar of profit. As the degeneration of American culture took generations, Pat says it will take generations to roll back, and that conservatives need to be rebels, having a counter-revolutionary spirit. We must target the minds of the youth as the Marxists did, by recapturing the culture. I suppose this is somewhat true now with the rise of meme culture, where primarily the right is creating original content for the consumption of the young, and the left can't meme apart from poor imitations of what the right has already made. As for practical policy, for the birth rates, Pat recommends changing government policy to be more pro-family and pro-child to increase the birth rates, as well as allowing employers to pay parents more money than a single person, giving them tax incentives to do so in order to bring back the family wage so the other parent can stay home. Instead of tax deduction for daycare, increase the tax credit for each child. As Pat says, we don't need more workers, we need more children. Business taxation should be decreased for small businesses and raised for large corporations. Death taxes should be abolished for family businesses and farms, and if new revenue is needed to balance these things out, do it through a tax on consumption and duties on imports. Pat does disclose that these may not be the best policies in terms of economics, but that is not why they are proposed. But what is at stake now is far more important than whether our economy grows at 3 or 4%. It is the survival of our civilization, culture, and country. As for the issue of mass immigration, Pat recommends significant cutbacks to legal immigration, a suspension of the H-1B program, no amnesty, and deportation of illegals. Additionally, English should become the official language of the United States, Puerto Rico should not be made a state, Border Patrol must be empowered, businesses that hire illegals be prosecuted, and NAFTA should not be expanded in any way, as Pat fears it would set us on the same path with Mexico as what turned into the European Union. As to globalist elites, we must turn away from organizations that carry us towards such an international loss of sovereignty, such as the UN, WTO, IMF, WHO, and more. Pat recommends opposing funding to the IMF and World Bank, reject the International Criminal Court and Kyoto Protocol, and abolish the WTO in favor of bilateral trade agreements. Additionally, oppose any expansion of NATO and withdraw troops from the world, as our intervention is costly in more ways than one. What happened on September 11, 2001 was a direct consequence of an interventionist U.S. policy in an Islamic world where no threat to our vital interests justifies our massive involvement. For the problem of anti-Western culture within the West, Pat recommends a cultural secession of sorts. You don't have to go full Amish, as that is an extreme example, but to choose more carefully what media you consume and who you give your money to. as well as homeschooling your children, moving to less culturally polluted environments, and putting together online communities. Look back to movies and books made in earlier times when America was still America, says Pat. If raw sewage is being dumped in the reservoir, buy bottled water. The rule applies to a polluted culture. Talking of political action, Pat has many recommendations. He specifies that the Supreme Court needs to be filled with constitutionalist conservative judges, and that the incorporation doctrine that allows restrictions on Congress to be imposed on the states via the 14th Amendment be overturned, as it lets the court rule the nation. Pat also says to do away with the neocons who do nothing to save the West, quoting Sam Francis, who called neoconservatism the helpless persuasion. Additionally, Pat writes that we should openly defy political correctness, countering hate crime propaganda with truth, and pursuing pro-life laws. The political recommendations continue with calls for citizen boycotts, the key being to focus on one particular product from one particular brand at a time. On matters of culture and tradition, if our politicians don't have the backbone to stand up, give it to the people in the form of a referendum. The Cultural Revolution needs to be defunded, as many parts of it feed from tax dollars. Tax credits should be given to parents for choosing which school is right for them, with schools determining how they should be run, not the federal government. Pat also calls for states and communities to enforce standards of decency to fight against the degeneracy of modern art. Lastly, children should be given more focus on history in their education to learn more about the great achievements of their ancestors. That's your quick rundown. In any case, links in the description. See you guys later.